In this video, we're going to be discussing the brain and the cerebrum and the cerebellum of the brain particularly. And I've given you a huge amount of information in your notes, and so we'll also be kind of poking our way through your notes packet, and I'll be pointing out some things that are that I think are especially important for you to really pay attention to. And I might even be able to pull some things out of the notes that you don't need to really focus a lot of your attention on. Okay, so the brain is very large in humans, especially as compared to other animals and other of the hominids. So human brain is relatively large, something like 3 pounds, and this is where we find about 98% of the body's nervous tissue. So it is large, and it is the primary controller of a lot of most of the body function. It takes a huge chunk of the blood that is sent from the heart, and it requires this constant blood supply because it needs to be able to make a lot of ATP to maintain neural function. There's not a lot of capacity for storing any energy in the brain, and so we've got to keep the glucose and the oxygen coming, else brain death begins to occur very rapidly. So we start to lose some, especially some of the more energetically demanding portions of the brain. Okay, so now I go into, in the notes, I go into this whole brain development section, and I'm just going to say, why don't you skip that? Don't worry about learning that for the exam. So let's turn your attention away from that and toward now the cerebrum, and that's where we're going to get going first. So the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, and it's by far the most superior portion of the brain. And by the way, we are on, if you're keeping track in your notes, we're on about the middle of, or actually almost to the end of page 14. It's composed of 2 hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere, and they are connected to each other by the corpus callosum, which is this really thick band of white matter, primarily, so it's primarily axons that are transmitting impulses between the right and left hemispherical halves. Anywhere that you see a lump up, that is a gyrus. These are the elevated ridges. Oh my, I'm seeing that. Looks like my picture cut off the words there, but hopefully you can read that says elevated ridges that are on the surface of the cerebrum. That's a gyrus, and we talk about lots of them, then they are gyri. The sulcus is the valley that's in between the two two adjacent gyri, and so in the very deepest sulci, and sulci is plural for sulcus, the very deepest ones are referred to as fissures, and so there are 2 big deep fissures that are found around the cerebrum, or associated with the cerebrum. There's a longitudinal fissure which extends all the way down to the superior surface of the corpus callosum, and then there's the transverse fissure that's posterior and underneath the brain. So here we can actually see the transverse fissure. That's where the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, bends around and is separated from the cerebellum. So it's the cerebrum that is responsible for all of our conscious thought, for our ability to receive sensory information and interpret it. So we make the sensations that we get from the body, we turn them into, oh, that hurt, or wow, that's warm, or ooh, chilly. So we create these perceptions, we talk about them as, based on sensory information coming up, and that all happens in the cerebrum. It's where memory, our thinking, our judgment, where voluntary motor actions are produced. are all in the cerebrum. So, of course, very, very important component of the brain. So, the cerebrum is divided into different lobes, and these lobes are separated from each other by sulci and by fissures. The frontal lobe is right there at the very front portion of the cerebrum. This is where thought is and memory, where moods and emotions, aggressiveness versus passivity, that's all in the frontal lobe. It's where we come up with the voluntary motor functions that we do, and it's where planning occurs. So lots and lots of very important characteristics associated with the frontal lobe. Personality is here as well. So frontal lobe is all about who we are and what we're choosing to do. The parietal lobe, these are, and there are two of them, there's a right and left parietal lobe, just like there's a right and left frontal lobe. This is where we get sensory reception and where we integrate all of the general senses. So general senses are things like hot, cold, pain is integrated here. What else is ticklishness, all of our touch and deep pressure senses, those are the general senses. And we also integrate taste and some visual information here as well. Occipital lobe, way at the back of the brain, and there is a right and left occipital lobe as well. This is the primary region of vision interpretation. The temporal lobe, these are along the lateral portions of the cerebrum. This is where hearing is managed, and a lot of the smell is managed there as well. Learning and memory, and some emotional behavior, as well as being able to recognize something visually. So you can look at something and say, "Oh, that's a flower," or "Wow, that's a cat." These are that recognition when we see things is being managed in the temporal lobe. And then finally, if you peel back the temporal lobe and look deep, there's a region where there is the frontal, the parietal, and the temporal lobe kind of all come together, and that's referred to as the insula. And it is believed to be involved in understanding, making sense of spoken language, as well as taste and integrating other sensory information. So lots of different functions, and so for this section, I would really encourage you to pay attention. What are the primary functions of each section, and then be able to identify where these lobes of the brain are found. So each of the right and left cerebral hemispheres receive information from and then send motor commands out to the opposite sides of the body. So recall that the neurons that are feeding up into the cerebrum are decussate, so they bring information from opposite sides of the body. And each cerebral hemisphere is composed of both gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is found at the cerebral cortex. Notice here the cerebral cortex is in gray, and it is just the outer rind of the cerebrum. But all the folds, the convolutions that are provided by the sulci and the gyri, they allow for greater surface area to the cerebrum, giving us more cerebral cortex. So the cortex makes up about 40% of the cerebrum's mass. The white matter, that's the internal region of the cerebrum. This is, again, where all of the axons are found for the cell bodies that are associated with the cerebrum, and for neurons that are bringing information up to the cerebrum. And then finally, we have what are termed the basal nuclei. And so these are the basal nuclei here. Basal meaning deep at the base. So here at the base of the cerebrum, we have these little islands of gray matter that are found there in the white matter. And here you can make out where the basal nuclei are kind of located there at the base of the cerebrum. And we'll look at some of their functions as well. Okay, so let's first look at the cerebral cortex. And if you're playing along in your notes, this is now page 16. The cerebral cortex is built of billions, I mean just huge numbers of cell bodies, as well as unmyelinated nerve fibers. That's why it's all gray matter. And then the neuroglial cells that are supporting the neurons. And then, of course, the blood supply is there. And the cortex is where we receive sensory input from and then transmit motor impulses out to the opposite sides of the body. So they, again, are contralateral. So those cassate nerve fibers cause this contralateral thing. And in the cortex, there are sensory areas. These are the areas that are going to bring in and then interpret sensory information. There are association areas. These are the regions of the cortex that collect information from multiple sources and compare them, make sense of them, that do all of the complex integration that we think of with the cerebrum. So our memory, the emotional stuff, reasoning, the ability to think your way through a task, will, so that idea that I'm going to do this intentional piece of our function, personality, intelligence, all of those characteristics are association functions. And then finally, the cerebral cortex has motor areas, and these are areas where we organize and then initiate whatever motor response is happening. Whatever motor response the association areas determined was the appropriate thing to do. So sensory brings in information. Association is about dealing with that information, making decisions around that information. And then the motor areas are responsible for, and here in the association areas, we organize, we plan what the motor response is going to be. And then the motor areas send out the information of, here's what the association areas have decided to do, now make it happen. So, we'll look at these three different categories of areas now in some deeper detail with your notes. So here we are at the bottom of page 16. Among the sensory areas, there's the primary somatosensory cortex, and it's there at the parietal lobe, and this is where we receive all the general sensory information coming from the skin and the joints and the muscles. And it tells us a lot about what's happening at the surface of the body and where the body is in relation to itself. So where the arms are, the legs are in relationship to the rest of the body. And the transmission here is contralateral. So that means we get information to the primary somatosensory cortex from opposite sides of the body. The primary sensory areas, these are all the areas that bring in sense organs associated with the head. So bringing information from those sense organs. So there's the visual area in the occipital lobe, the auditory area in the temporal lobe and in the insula, the olfactory cortex that is in the temporal lobe plus a little bit of the frontal lobe, the gustatory cortex, this is taste, that is in the parietal lobe and in the insula, and then our equilibrium. Now, equilibrium is primarily in the cerebellum, but there's also some in the thalamus, so deep, more toward the brainstem. Equilibrium is not in most of equilibrium is not in the cerebrum, but it's in other parts of the brain. Okay, so those are the sensory areas. You know, those three primary somatosensory cortex, and the primary sensory areas. Now, the association areas, these are the regions that are going to take and integrate the sensory information coming in. There's the prefrontal cortex, which is way at the very front of the frontal lobes. This is where personality and a lot of where thinking and planning and the ability to persist, and even some of the emotional components of our makeup are all associated with the prefrontal cortex. And back in the 30s all the way to the 50s, we were actually, because we understood that personality was there when we were dealing with people who had mental illness. Frequently, this is a frontal lobotomy was a very crude surgery that just went and kind of scrambled up some of the prefrontal that prefrontal cortex and really messed some people up badly. The somatosensory association area, this is in the parietal lobes, and this is where we're making sense of what's going on with all that somatosensory information that's coming in from the somatosensory areas. The motor association areas, this is where we coordinate and make sense of movement or do organized and smooth movement. The general interpretation area, it's also called Wernicke's area or the Gnostic area, and it is not very well defined. It involves the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital lobes, and it is associated with often the primary hemisphere, the hemisphere of the brain that is controlling a lot of language stuff is generally where we find Wernicke's area. The speech centers, these help allow us to plan and then carry out the communication using speech and written word. And then the language area, which is found in the opposite hemisphere of Wernicke's area, that is managing a lot of the nonverbal and emotional content of language, interpreting all that. Okay, then finally the motor areas. The primary motor cortex, also called the somatic motor cortex, has contralateral transmission. It is in the frontal lobe, so just in front of just to the front of the seam or the sulcus between the frontal and parietal lobes, and this is where, again, we initiate all of the motor movements that we do, the conscious movement that we do. The premotor cortex, this is where learned motor skills that are repetitious are kind of managed. Broca's area, this is the speech motor area where we send out all of the transmission that's going to control the throat and the mouth and the lungs during speech. The frontal eye field, this controls the eye movements. And then last of all, there's some information about brain lateralization, which is the recognition that the right and the left hemispheres are not exactly alike. They have many, many, many similar areas, but there are also some both physical but primarily functional differences between the right and left hemisphere. And so now here we are. We can look back at I've got a new slide for you here. And so the two hemispheres go by. They're given different names. There's the categorical hemisphere, which is where the general interpretive and speech centers are found. And this is where a lot of our intellect and reasoning is located. It's specialized for spoken and written languages, and also for sequential planning, organizing, and analytical reasoning. And it helps to control the more emotional parts of our brain that are, so this is the hemisphere where we kind of suppress a lot of emotional responses. The opposite hemisphere, then, so and right versus left, really, there's a how that determination of whether you're going to be a right-brained or left-brained person, that is, we don't understand a lot about where that comes from. So if you're right-brained, then the categorical hemisphere is found in the right side. If you're left-brained, then the left side is the categorical hemisphere. So the opposite hemisphere is the representational hemisphere. This is where we analyze sensory information and relate sensory information back to the body. It's where imagination, the insight, sort of the leaps of intuition, musical and artistic skills then are managed in the representational hemisphere. And it is all about managing or dealing with sensory information and making comparisons among all of the senses that are bringing the information, so that we can gather the emotional context for conversations and for interactions with other humans. So representational is very much the emotional side of the brain. And so depending on, there's a lot of connection between where the cerebral lateralization and what our handedness is. So if you're right-handed, then most people who are right-handed have the categorical hemisphere on the left side. Among left-handed, then you see a much greater population with the categorical hemisphere being on the right side. I'm sorry, on the left side. Wait, let me try that again. If you are left-handed, then a much greater percentage of people who are left-handed have the right hemisphere as being categorical. So 96% of righties have a left categorical hemisphere, where 15% of lefties have a right hemisphere being the dominant hemisphere. Okay, hopefully that made it a little clearer, and you've got that in your notes as well. Okay, so the white matter of the brain. Wait, where's the stuff about the... Okay. White matter of the brain. It is, it's composed of myelinated axons and neuroglia that are all kind of lumped and clumped together into large tracts. Remember, those are bundles of myelinated axons. And we can put classify those tracts into one of three different groups. There's the commissural tracts, and I think I need an extra S in my notes. I've got it spelled correctly in your notes package. These are the tracts that carry information from one side of the brain to the other. So, for instance, the corpus callosum is a very large tract of commissural axons. Association axons, they transmit information, or association, the axons that we think of as association white matter, they transmit information within a hemisphere to link together the perceptions, the memories that are being processed in that hemisphere. And then the projection white matter, this connects the cortex out to the rest of the nervous system. So they connect the cortex down to the lower brain centers, and then out throughout the out throughout the body, out to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that does it for the cerebrum. So now the diencephalon, this is all part of the brain stem, includes the thalamus, and I definitely want you to pay attention to the thalamus functions and the hypothalamus, and notice what the functions are there. Definitely pay very close attention to note I have right there at the bottom of page 22, read about the hypothalamic functions in the text. So pay very close attention to those functions. That'll be important. The epithalamus, and then down into the brainstem, which is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain with these structures, the cerebral peduncles, the cerebral aqueduct, which, remember, connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, the corpora quadrigemina. Now we're on page 24. The pons, which is part of the brain stem there on the anterior surface of the brain stem. It acts as a rooting center, is how I think of it. Information coming up from the body, it passes through the pons, and then connections are made that send that information to multiple locations in the cerebrum. The medulla also has this rooting function, but it's also the location of many of the basal functions of the body. We have to keep the body alive sorts of functions. So it's where we see the cardiac center. Now we're at the top of page 25. The cardiac center, the vasomotor center, so managing all the function of the cardiovascular system, and then the respiratory center, which is controlling rate and depth of breathing, and then a variety of other centers, including the vomiting reflexes located here, swallowing reflexes, all of the stuff that goes down when we cough or sneeze, salivation, there's some speech regulation here, and so on. So lots and lots of very important basal motor functions are found there in the medulla oblongata, and so damage to the medulla could be very, very dangerous. Okay, now we're ready to move into the cerebellum. This is again on the middle now of page 25. Lots of information again that I'm giving you about the structure and some of the function of the brain. The cerebellar peduncles connect are tracks that connect the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So there's the superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. So the superior connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the pons, and then through the pons on up into the higher brain, while the inferior cerebellar peduncles connect the cerebellum to the medulla. And so there's lots of communication between the cerebellum and the medulla. The cerebellum is primarily responsible for maintaining coordination and balance of the body. So it controls a lot of the equilibrium motor functions so that we don't top over. And it also has some role in learned motor functions as well. So once we get motor functions learned, then we can do them rotely because the cerebellum helps to manage that.